isn't Sunday, you can definitely move up closer. We're going to talk about creeping things a little later, but none of them are going to bite. So feel free to move up closer. Should we just have a word of prayer when we start here? Dear Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to present this. We thank you for your creation and for how cogent it is, how accurate it is. We pray that this will be a blessing to each one who came here today and those who might be listening later on online. And we just pray that your Spirit would move in us and help us to understand these, some of which are difficult things. And pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So today we're going to cover the third session, which is the fifth and sixth segments of what I've been calling quarks to quasars. Maybe you figured it out at this point, but I'm trying to go from the smallest aspects of creation to the largest aspects of creation. And we're still in the process of sort of setting the stage for, his own image, us, God's own image of man. But that comes a few more sessions down the road. So we've already covered, by way of review, in case maybe some people weren't here, we had an introductory time where we just kind of set the scene for what are the issues, how do we do a scientific evaluation of the data that's out there, what is the attitude of the evolutionists towards creation, which we all know. And then we covered the littlest things, the quarks and atoms and how they may have formed according to evolution. And the thing I had thought was very most interesting is how, in order to explain quantum mechanics and string theory, you needed 7 extra dimensions in addition to the four that we have. And we talked about how angels can appear. So there's clearly got to be other dimensions besides that which we, as in our human form, are able to understand. So it kind of fits. But then we covered a little bit bigger things, molecules, how biochemistry and all that stuff really works, and a little bit of the genetics of things and the energy systems. And then we last week also covered cells, how we really, cells really is the definition of life, something that can reproduce itself. And we went over just some of the complexities involved in that, going from non-life to life, which is the general term abiogenesis. Today we're going to go from life to man. So we're going to go through some population arguments and some of the mathematics that might indicate why a shorter creation definitely makes more sense. And we're going to use the classification of life by Linnaeus, which we're going to get to in a little while, as most actually evolutionists do, to show what is the journey, as I'm calling it, the journey to man, from amoeba to man, so to speak. And we'll cover that as we go. I'm just going to remind you, as I do every time, that the broad principles in studying any science is that wrong assumptions are going to lead to wrong conclusions. So we always have to evaluate what we're starting from, what our biases might be, and we all have biases. And then we're going to talk as well a little bit about the hierarchy as we go along of uncertainty, shall we say. And I'm going to stay to this part of the facts, provable theories, and principles. I don't want us to get too much in the weed about the hypotheses, the opinions that are out there. Opinions, I remember hearing long ago, it's like noses, everybody's got one, so anyway. And then also remember that things are more complex than portrayed, and I'm going to be presenting them in a less complex way, just so we can understand it, so we can put our brain around it a little bit. And I'm going to posit to you, doesn't it take more faith to believe in evolution than it does in creationism? I think the first 2 sessions, I would have come to that conclusion, and I think you'll agree with me that here. Yet knowledge is power, and I looked it up. It's sort of pseudo-scripture. It's Francis Bacon, in his Sacred Meditations book, came across this. But to get right to scripture is that we really should strive. We've been entreated to strive, to know what we can, because we shall know the truth, and the truth shall make us free. And a wise man is strong, and knowledge increases strength. So it's in that context that we think that this is a worthwhile thing to do. I've told you as well, there's about 4 different categories that I've broken it down into that are sort of measuring sticks, areas of evaluation of the facts as they apply to the theories of evolution and creationism. I hate to contradict Pastor, but I'm not going to be able to prove creation. Nobody's been able to prove creation, but then again, nobody's been able to prove the theory of evolution either. The idea here is let's present the theories that go in there and then see where the facts line up. And I think this crowd is going to agree with me that it's going to line up more in the creation side. That's the conclusion, my bias, that I've come to. So there's a bunch of mathematical considerations. I like to say you can always trust the math as long as you've made the proper definitions from the beginning. and demonstrate how there can be violations or really misapplications of logic and even science principles, things that just are totally more than counterintuitive, they're counter to what seems to be the bedrock of scientific proof. And evaluating whether something could have gotten the way it got through a supernatural design. Is a so-called irreducible complexity involved in some of these things? Everything had to work together at once or it couldn't work independently. Or does it make more sense that somehow natural selection, trial and error could lead to this? And then many times that there's scriptural basis or even contradictions for many of the other sides of thinking. So the purpose of this section is going to be really about generally threefold. I want to talk first a little bit about the mathematics of populations. And then we're going to introduce the concept of the classification systems. And then we're going to really go through this. The majority of this will be, as I say, I call the journey to man, from amoeba to man, and just trace at each major step, not everyone, just a few of these steps, what a huge transformation has to take place, even just morphologically. We're kind of leaving the biochemistry, but I don't want you to forget the biochemistry. That everything has to be written into that DNA for any of this stuff to happen. And recognize just the hugeness and how everything had to work at every step together, or it would have been the end of that species, or life as we know it. And just gain some superficial, at least, appreciation for how some imaginations have crept into from the right side of that scale and towards the left part of that scale I showed you earlier. The opinions have become accepted as facts. It's kind of like propaganda, dare we say. And how some hoaxes have even been introduced to sort of fertilize that narrative. So math is against long evolution. I don't want us to get caught in the weeds, but for anybody who wants to go over the math with me, I'm happy to sit here and show you. But this is just a growth curve, an exponential growth curve, where we can figure out in the nth generation how many females should there be if we can control the number of, calculate it for the number of generations or the number of females that a female produces. Now, figuring that people are twice, but at least still males can't have babies. I'm not allowed to say that in the Senate hearing, but we can say that here. And then we can just integrate that, and we can figure out how many people should have lived at any given point. So if we do that, it's actually rather interesting. If we have the growth of, this would be 2.15 people per generation, so it's just barely over zero population growth. It would so happen that if after 6,000 years, which is about 300 generations, there should be about double this, 5 billion people. We're around 8, 7.5, something like that right now. So we're pretty close. And about 30 billion people should have lived at this point. And most general, non-scientific estimates are right in line with these numbers, believe it or not. Now, they don't arrive at it because of the way I just wrote it, but that's what they believe in. Now, just think for a moment, if there was even just 100,000 years from the first man to now, or 5,000 generations, we should have 10 to the 157th. We talked a little bit about these exponents and how these numbers are just unimaginably large. 157 would be something like hitting the Powerball like 20 times in a row. I think it's a 10 to the 8th chance that you're going to hit the Powerball. So then just divide 157 by 8, 20 times in a row, more or less. So just think how improbable that could be. And there should be about 15 times that who are dead. Even if we assume a really small growth rate, we still get very, very large numbers. So another way to calculate, just sort of internally connect, you always like to get to the same conclusion by multiple different methods if you can. If we say, well, what's been the average growth? About 0.4% is even an underestimation of what's the annual growth rate of the world's population. And we get about the same numbers. Now, interestingly, instead of getting 25 billion in 6,000 years, if we do 4,500 years with about 5% growth per year, we get about the 6 billion, about where we are today. Now, 4,500 years ago, of course, was the flood, right? More or less. So anyway, now, just do a little thought. I just ran the numbers because I thought this was an interesting thing. I've never seen it done this way before, but if the volume of a human skeleton is about 15 liters, and I looked it up, and the volume of the earth is this number, be with me here, 30 billion people dead would be a volume of this, which is just less than 1 meter thick around the surface of the earth. If there, of course, 3/4 of the earth is water, but a very small amount of bones. Now, the bones will decay after a certain number of years, of course. But however, if we were to use these numbers up here with how many you'd think you should have, we'd have so many dead that it would be 10 to the 132nd of the Earth's volume, which couldn't happen. Even with, it means it would turn over, even if you to say it would decay, and it's just too much. And even if we use a super low number, we're still going to be an amount of dead here. This is this 1 point, what did I say it was? 0.1, just 1% growth. It would fill the whole volume of the Earth. So we should have so many bones and skeletons and fossils that we wouldn't be able to build roads and bridges, So it's just, the conclusion is that math is against long time of evolution, just from a population standpoint. Now, I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of the Hardy-Weinberg principle. It is this guy Hardy was a mathematician, Weinberg was a German physician. And they found that numerically, statistically, if you have two disparate genes, alleles, for a given trait, and you let them mix, usually they don't go to the better trait. They meet in the middle somewhere. Something like the regression to the mean. I mean, that's a principle all in life, right? So there's no drive for evolution on a statistical basis. And evolution has to posit that natural selection is what drives it. Now, this is one of a couple different places where I'm going to point out that evolution is really against the agenda of the people who are believing in evolution. So would you say, isn't evolution anti-globalism? Because it says that some people are better than others, survival of the fittest after all, right? Well, if that's the thing, that's the kind of principle that led to Nazism. We talked about that in the introduction. But it's against Scripture, right? There's no respect of persons with God. These are just a couple of, there's many times where that comes up in Scripture. So, and there's other cracks in these rock-solid tenets of evolution. Evolution really as a theory was put together based purely on morphology. Darwin didn't know anything about, nor did anybody at the time, didn't know anything about molecular biology, didn't really know much about cell biology or theories or anything like that. It was purely based on the few species that existed at the time. Science has progressed and we know a lot more about the molecular basis for these things as we went over last week. And even in evolution circles, standard Darwinian evolution is being deserted. They recognize that uniformitarianism, constant gradualism is being discarded, and we'll talk about that in the last session about some of the other alternate theories in this punctuated equilibrium, as they call it, where there's just all of a sudden a series of miracles that everything came together, and the steering wheel, the engine, the body, and it just all came together miraculously, and there was a quantum leap forward in terms of function. And you're going to see how many of those kinds of quantum leaps are necessary, even just on the organism level, as we're going to cover today. And remember, as well as we've talked before, that most mutations are negative. In fact, many of them are lethal from one generation to another. And in fact, this is the usual reason for most miscarriages. There's been some sort of mutation in the process. So at any rate, as sad as miscarriages can be, it's usually because of that. So there's a proof of creationism, so to speak, in a miscarriage, if you want to look for a silver lining. And remember as well, any mutation that has to get passed on to another generation has to be written into the DNA code, or else it can't be passed on. But they didn't know about that in late 19th century. There's another fallacy, that's as I'm calling it, of extrapolating from micro to macro evolution. We wouldn't argue that there's a certain degree of natural selection. I mean, taller people, this is Manute Bol, the tallest guy ever played in the NBA, happened to be on the same team as the shortest guy, Muggsy Bogues, 5'3". So this is just a cute little picture here. But I mean, most NBA players are a lot taller than the average, right? Most jockeys that ride horses are lighter and smaller than other people. And you get more calluses in your hand. You adapt. We are an adaptable person. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden those changes somehow then are inherited by the next generation to make you more fit for survival. So just be wary, because they'll play that too much. And if you don't really think through what their hypothesis is, you'll just accept it. Now, we're going to move on to the guts of this first talk, really, is the classification of life. This is Carl Linnaeus, who's known as the father of modern taxonomy. He was born to a Lutheran minister in Sweden, trained in Netherlands, and was a professor at the University of Uppsala at a young age when he published this seminal book called the Systema Natura. And that became the basis for classifying life. He used certain categories to try to decide, how we fit things. His first edition was only about 200 or so animal species and about the same number of plant species. By the time 20 years later he'd put 10 editions together, we had this number of species identified in his categorization. Today, 21st century, we have more like 1 million or 8 million, depending upon how you count it. And there's some 17,000 new species being added daily. That's not because 17,000 species are being evolved daily. It's just that they're slicing and dicing and discovering things and adding to that. There's some thought that there might be as many as 100 million species. We're going to talk about species in a bit. It was only later, after Darwinism, that there was some evolutionary organization in terms of these cladistic kinds of things that you might see in certain textbooks. But again, I have to emphasize, all of this was based on Darwin's time, the late 19th century, on morphology and homology, meaning that wings and arms, or legs and beaks and noses, things like that. Which is a very gross way of looking at things. It's like kind of putting together cars. Okay, well, a Maserati is a two-seater, and a Volkswagen is a two-seater, so they should be in the same category. Well, I don't think so. Right? Depends on how you want to put things together. So when I was in school, we had to memorize this, and we had this little mnemonic called kapakaphags. If you're going to say, well, what language is that? It's no language. It's just a mnemonic, standing for the increasing specificity in the classification system, starting from the kingdom to the phylum, to the class, the order, the family, genus, and species. And there's very extensive in all this. Since I finished school, there's actually been now, they name a domain or a realm, which we'll talk about. And just historically, Haeckel, who's the one that made that false thing about ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, I'll show a picture later. He actually, after this, added this phylum, which it's an important thing. So this is an example of kind of the classification, and we're going to go through that. Excuse me. So that gives rise to these trees that you see all the time about how you start from a common ancestor and there's this branch point and that branch point and other branch points. And you have to be aware these are hypotheses only. Nobody's ever observed a single branch point, much less the whole tree that's being said here. The definition of a species generally was given as a group of living organisms consisting of similar individuals capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding. We talked a little bit about that last time in the context of a donkey and a horse becoming a mule and not being able, the mule is sterile. But the species definition can be very fuzzy, and it's always changing. So again, this is not a mathematical or even chemistry determination, really. There's a lot of subjectivity, is what I'm trying to say. Just to be complete, viruses are outside of life. They can't reproduce on their own. They have to take over a cell, a human cell, or just another cell. It doesn't have to be a human. And this guy, David Baltimore from the University of California, came up with this classification that everyone follows. And I don't want to go through the details, but just I thought it would be of interest that this category 4 here is the thing that's wrecked our life for 3 years, right? This is where the coronavirus is from. And recognize that the coronavirus, it's only an RNA. It's one of the largest, though. It's the same virus family, so to speak, as the rhinovirus, your common cold, and as also polio, interestingly enough. But so it's not considered life because it can't self-replicate. And there's some debate, well, maybe it started with viruses and that embedded itself, Prions, you might have heard of, those are just proteins that somehow have a feedback action on, remember I told you last week how there can be 98% of your DNA is regulatory. So those proteins can make other proteins fold abnormally, and that's what can cause disease. The most famous prion disease is this mad cow disease. We'll just call it mad cow disease. You don't need to hear the science one. So let's move on just a little bit before we start using that to these geological ages. I think I mentioned this before in the very first thing, is that you've seen these kinds of things that, well, we start with the Precambrian and then the Paleozoic. Who can memorize all these things? You can't. But how are these? Are these defined by carbon dating? No. How do you think they're defined? Circularly. They're defined by what what different kinds of fossils you find at each different layer, under the presumption that the less complicated things will be the earliest or the longer ago, and the more complicated, more complex, I'm putting air quotes around complex because we've said before even the minorest of life is very complex, but and so it's circularly defined. But smaller things, we're going to talk about the flood in the context next week of some geology. Little things are going to sediment to the bottom of a mixture of multiple sized things. It's just like that's where all the paper clips are, at the bottom of your drawer, right? Because they settle down there. And the bigger things will be at the top of the drawer. You know, the bigger erasers or boxes of pens or something like that. That's going to float to the top of your drawer. In the same way, after a flooding circumstance, this is exactly the order, just based on size determination, that you'd expect things to be. So the tree of life is something, this is from Darwin's notebook. So he had this concept that there is this common ancestor and there's these different branch points as we go along. So to just work with what they say somewhat, this would be the tree of life, right? One common ancestor. The creationist view would be that there's multiple things that appeared, and maybe they've gotten further advanced, in different kinds from different times. Now, I mentioned before that there's now this neo-Darwinism or neo-creationist orchard of a tree of life where they say, oh, well, there's these things that happened at different times, and then that was the jump start to get different kinds of, mammals or birds or whatever it is. So just to let you know that. So let's try to, again, as I say, work with the tools of evolution, because we can use their tools and show how there's problems. So I'm going to call this, as I say, Journey to Man. Now, I mentioned before, and I'm going to keep reminding you, there's these different increasing specificity of a classification system, right? I mean, you've got a car, you've got four-wheel cars, and you've got two-door cars, and you've got cars that can go fast, and you've got cars that, have electronics in them. Or you can categorize in all different ways, so there's more usually things at the lower part of this than there are at the top, more categories. Now, when I was going to school, we had Monaria, and then we had the eukaryotic cells, so we had 5 kingdoms. Well, now they call these 1, 2, 3 domains, and they've made bacteria have its own domain. So, at any rate, basically to get past this line, we're going from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells. And we talked about that last time a little bit as well, that the prokaryotes, although they have simpler systems in their cell structure, they still use the Krebs cycle, a very complex multi-protein way of getting energy that's the universal way of getting energy of every single form of life that's creeping the earth. There's no inferior one that's sort of having some remnants. There's no evidence in any way that there was something different besides the Krebs cycle ever. The DNA, the organic molecules, we talked about how complex really the flagella is, the microtubules that's got these dynein and kinine things that make it swirl so that the one iglena, the one little single cell thing can float around. So they had to develop all those different things to go from prokaryote to eukaryote. So the major step going from the eukaryotic domain to the Animalia kingdom is that they had to learn how to use oxygen. Animals can move one way, shape, or form. They can produce sexually, means they don't just divide and make a carbon copy of themselves. There's more complex genetics with crossing over of genes and gene material with meiosis we talked about last week. And then don't lose sight of the fact that there's this what's called ontogenic stage. All the developments, just because you've divided a couple cells doesn't mean you really have your organism yet. Those cells have to divide into muscle cells, into, heart cells, into skin cells, into bone cells. So every cell, as we talked before, has exactly the same DNA code. It's just a matter of how that code is expressed in that particular location, which is under the control of, again, a only very incompletely understood set of circumstances. So the Animalia kingdom has about 30 or 40 phyla. We're in the Animalia, but they're going to say 11 most important, and one most important to us is this chordata, which is essentially the same as vertebrates. Not exactly, but essentially the same. So we're going to take a little sidestep first for a moment. Imagine here we talked about, I think, the long ages, and life was supposedly beginning somewhere over here 1 billion years ago. And life just kind of kicked along, not anything. But then all of a sudden, in a minuscule 10 million years, there was this, what they call Cambrian explosion, where all of these phylum just all of a sudden appeared. Again, it would be like putting together a few screws and bolts and things, and then all of a sudden a car appears. It took forever to be able to cast all that, and then now we've got a car, as I was saying. So this is, again, a small time frame, and just everything happened at once. Do you think any other way? Is there any other ideas about how that could have happened, that everything happened at once? I bet you could, So, but now let's, again, have a timeout. Here we went for a few billion years, and maybe we got a single cell, and maybe something that we can almost in our human beings duplicate. And then, in just a short period of time, we have really complex organisms. I mean, really complex organisms. And it just, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think you'd agree the same thing. So what are evolutionists going to do? Like anything else, you just make up these smart-sounding terms, and you kind of disarm a person who's wondering about it, and even deceive them because you say, oh, it was hidden evolution, or its critical constituents had not, evolved yet, but when they did, all of a sudden they came together. Okay, everything at the same time. That just all these terms. Then there's even this thing called Doulos law, that once there's been an advanced change, it can never go the other way. Well, suppose something happened with this pinnacle of evolution, and then a storm came, and they drowned it. Well, you would have lost all that work product. We didn't have it backed up on a computer, But Doulos law says, or presumes, that never happened. So that was meant to be a guy waving his hands, to explain this. So back to our journey to man. We were talking about the phylum we're in, which is Chordata, and that's what we're going to focus on now. Now, I thought one little interesting thing is the definition of, well, we're supposedly close to a starfish. We're called deuterostomes. And I thought it was interesting that a deuterostome is defined, in other words, we are defined by our anus forming before our mouth. Okay, maybe that, I just thought that was interesting. Nobody else did. So now invertebrates are a subphylum, but they're essentially the same. Invertebrate means you don't have a backbone. Okay, so imagine going from no backbone to a backbone, and knowing that there's nothing in between, and you're going from a super complex into a super complex situation, a very new, sea change of having a backbone. This is a major puzzle, needless to say, for evolution. And there was nothing for about 1 million years, and then all of a sudden this showed up 1 million years after that phylum, that Precambrian explosion. Again, no intermediate forms. And then you say, well, why do we have to presume that there is a transition? We have plenty of invertebrates today, and they're doing just fine, playing a very vital role. I mean, after all, if you go fishing, don't you bring some worms and have your invertebrates to catch your fish? I mean, they play important roles in our life, is all I'm trying to say. So what did we have to do to go from Animalia kingdom, just to summarize? We had to develop a notochord, in other words, a spinal cord. We had to develop a spinal cord. We had to have a mechanism to filter food and get nutrients out of the world. Now, the evolutionists will say that what the thyroid is a remnant of that organ. I don't really know how they get that, but then we have these pharyngeal slits, which are supposedly related to feeding. They like to show a picture of these pharyngeal slits, say, oh, these are old leftover gills. No, they have nothing to do with breathing. They're feeding, if anything. And we somehow had to develop a tailbone. So now in the phylum of Chordata, which is, again, approximately equal to vertebrates, but it's not exactly, there's 5 common classes. Again, I'm simplifying it. There's usually a lot more. And I'm putting these 5 in here because this is what you've probably learned. And this is kind of the dogma going from, that the thinking is we went from fish to amphibians to reptiles to birds to mammals on the way to get to man. And understand a big difference there is going from a cold-blooded to a warm-blooded animal. That's another huge difference. Why? Because for warm-blooded, you need 7 times the metabolic rate all of a sudden. You need to develop body hair, which is not the same thing as as scales. You have to have ways of controlling various chemicals in water, with water control in your body. You have to have a kidney to filter those things out. You have to be able to control your blood pressure. And are these transitions even possible? Much less do we see examples of it. I mean, how can you go from, something all the way to nothing without something in between? And there's how can you even have something in between? Now, the steps to go to the next, to the class of mammalia, mammals, is they have to develop mammary glands, which, by the way, you know that they have to have just the right nutritional components. Milk has to be produced at just the right time after birth, and it has to last just the right time. And, you know, not to mention that everything that makes the milk has to work the right way and in a very complex way. For many mammals, there's a bigger, much higher order brain that happens when you compare us to, you know, starfish or, you know, worms or something. As I said, hair and fur has to appear, and it's not the same thing as scales. There's many major differences. For some reason, we had to develop some middle ear bones. Our bone structure had to change. We had into a single jaw, whereas reptiles have multiple bones in their jaw. And I'll just, in case I'm losing somebody, I'll bring back the Bible into this, is that, remember, Samson took the jaw of a donkey and used that to slay those 1,000 people when he got mad about something. I can't remember, but anyway, in Judges, you can look it up. So, and then the warm-bloodedness is what I was saying. It's just, that's a huge difference that you can't possibly have made it part way. So the steps from mammalia to primary, we had to develop larger brains, but in the process, why would we lose our smell? Because usually mammals can't smell nearly as good as lower animals, right? Why would that happen? The hand has to develop, we live longer, and there's lots of interactions that are complex. I had to put this on there. This is called the homunculus. I don't know if you've ever heard it. It describes that the brain is disproportionately represented by things that drive the hand and the mouth, but the hand. And this is some artists putting sort of the relative size of the number of neurons in the brain that are devoted to the hand are much larger than devoted to the trunk or even the feet. You know, so all that had to happen, you know, basically like that. So now we go from the order of mammals and the order into the families. So we're going from, the order is the primate, right? Right. So we're going to the hominid family from the primate order. And that difference just makes it we can walk upright with only 2 feet. And there's only 4 genera that are listed here, but you know, we're not going to go through all the details of that, because man's the important one, to our discussion at least. It's the Homo genus is man, and that's way down here, and it's only man, only living genus of Homo is man right now. And we're, of course, Homo sapiens, which is the species within that. So now let's just talk. Everyone must have seen this Ascent of Man kind of set of drawings, right? And this is the idea here, is that we went in 25 million years from the littlest ape to us, right? The pinnacle of evolution. So the genus Pithecus, which is the New World monkeys. The New World monkeys are the ones that have broader faces, where the Old World monkeys are the ones with the narrower nose-like faces. Not that that matters, but so. And even the candidate steps that went through it, there's not much agreement. Most will agree that the Ramapithecus is not a man precursor, it's a precursor to orangutans, which I don't think we don't necessarily have to say it's a precursor or anything, but at least even evolutionists don't believe it fits into that category of man. It's not this guy here, you know. Australopithecus was found supposedly 2 million years ago, and they say this is the certain hominid. Well, I don't know about that, but we're going to come back and talk about this a little bit. They were only 3 feet tall, and this is, you might have heard of the Lucy, as they put a name on it, so you can get all warm and fuzzy about it, right? So the genus Homo, I said, man's the only one, and these are the different categories, and I was going to show, but I forgot my folder, that there's this, something was in a Wall Street Journal a week or 2 ago that they found, but this was not new, they've known about Homo bosaei or something like that, but they just found another treasure trove of fossils that they're dating to that, but they're probably just the same as man, right? But again, think of this, we took all this time to get to a 3-foot tall ape, and now all of a sudden, in only 500,000 years, a very short period of time, we've got man. Again, there's an awful lot that has to happen from a gibbon to become, you know, one of us. And we're going to just cover a couple of the major ones here. Australopithecus. Australo is a word root meaning south, so it's the southern apes. Pithecus is apes. So it's said to be this, it was first discovered, or at least what they're calling it, by this guy in South Africa. And it was more notoriety was when the Leakeys, Mary and Louise, who were PhDs, their son, who I guess must have grown up on the research field, never actually even went to college, but he became, this is this A boci that some others have found, called it. So he's now, I think he might still be alive, I'm not sure, Richard Leakey, but he's a big authority, even though he's never really had any of the formal training that the evolutionists value to be so defining of them. The Australopithecus was only about the size of a chimp brain. And Lucy, as I say, this is what was discovered at one point by this person. It's got a very small brain, only 3 feet or so tall. It was touted as the missing link. The most complete fossil they have of it is only a knee joint, and it's made out to be the earliest bipedal, 2-foot ancestor. But none of the fossils have knuckles or feet in them. So we still don't know if they're not the kind, those old monkeys even a gorilla will usually walk on 4, and it's called knuckle walking. So we can't even get fossil proof that happened. A little fun fact is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles was named after Lucy. But, just in case there was Beatle fans in here. So Lucy became a media sensation, right? And I put this on here just to say that when you put a face and you put some human sympathy into something, I mean, suppose this is because of global warming, right? But this polar bear, they can swim. He just happened to find himself a little rowboat out there in the middle of the water, and but they say, oh, it's melting, he's going to die because he's not. But they can swim. They swim over to the bigger icebergs and go catch some penguins, But anyway. So Neanderthal man. So is that a separate man? No. Neanderthal man is named for a place, the Neander Valley in Germany. And yes, they had all the kinds of things that humans do. And it became extinct. And a lot of people, including even Thomas Huxley, much less this guy Virchow, I mentioned him last week, the father of pathology, that it was just vitamin D deficiency that made him have this more prominent brow. If you have acromegaly and you get certain bone formations that happen. So he was probably just another modern man. It's nothing separate. But the Germans, the French couldn't let the Germans go, with the top. So they came up with their own. They found Cro-Magnon man, which is in France, in the Cro-Magnon Valley, or part of France in southwest called. And it's a lot of overlap with the Neanderthal man. They basically have all the same things. So that's nothing new. That's not another step in the whole thing. There's other problems with evolution theory when you look at human fossils, because there's a lot of these supposedly early ancestors that are found, for example here, in the same location as fossils of what we'd call modern humans. So it's not like they're the lower strata and we found them later. So, and then there's this ideological crisis. I wonder, well, if survival of the fittest is so important for evolution, then why are we so worried about things going extinct? They should say, yay, we got rid of that dodo bird, or the California condor. It wasn't helping us in any way. So now, but anyway, I'm just saying that, there's a lot of extinct things that are going along. Then there's hoaxes. Again, things that didn't fit the narrative, so they needed something to fit the narrative. I think I mentioned this one before, that this baby was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, probably the highest regarded general clinical medicine journal in our field. And they said, oh, see, this is a remnant of a tail. This was an earlier ape remnant left over, and it was just a fleshy growth once they took a biopsy and looked at it under the microscope. It wasn't. And I mentioned this one before, this guy, Ernest Haeckel. He fabricated these drawings to make it look like the different stages of a baby's development, of a human's development, looks like the different stages of going from, a frog to a mammal to a human. So it's agreed that it's a hoax. Yet, as recently as 2001, this guy Mayer, who was, I think he's now an emeritus professor at Harvard in biology, the definitive book on evolution has this picture in it without indicating that it was recognized to be a hoax. Even Stephen Gould, who I mentioned him before, I think he's died now too, but anyway, he agreed that it was a hoax, and this is the reference for that. Then there's all these pre-human skeletons that were discovered, but they were either a hoax, supposedly they were either a fraud or they were a mistake. Usually they were a cap of a gibbon. Usually it's just that they only have a small little piece. I think the Nebraska man turned out to be a tooth of a pig. Well, I don't know if there's any Midwesterners, but I'm wondering what else besides corn is there in Nebraska, but, but pigs. I don't know, bad joke. But then there's Peking man. The interesting thing about Peking man is that mysteriously, all of the fossils for Peking man disappeared somewhere around the time of the Communist Revolution. Okay. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, anyway. Okay. What about language? Only humans can speak. I mean, dogs can bark, and maybe people can understand their dog. I don't know, but can other primates understand language? Well, this is a famous person, Jane Goodell, who's supposedly got chimps to understand sign language, and so there's some capacity there. But even other lower beings can have similar capacities to communicate, right? There can be mimicry from parrots, and certain birds and pigeons and bees are notorious for they posture their body in certain ways, and that seems to mean something to the rest of the beehive. But consider the complexity of language. The vocabulary is pretty easy, but when you start putting a language together that's got to have sentence structure, then that's really hard. And there's really no incomplete languages anywhere. You haven't read that English, they used it differently, but it's the same basic structure. It's just they have different words or different ways they wrote the letters in Old English versus modern English. There's no language that seems to be incomplete that has demonstrated any kind of, evolution, if we're just looking for other parallels in the universe. We mentioned this before, written language. It seems to, is it a coincidence that written language seemed to come on right around the time of the Tower of Babel? I don't know, but we don't have any definite written language earlier. And even these cave paintings that were supposedly older, they're using dating methods that have been shown to be not as accurate as they're made out to be. And you can do some numbers and show that putting letters together to make them meaningful words is just, there's got to be designed to get a language. You can't just do that. Races. Did you know that you really can't look at the DNA of different races and distinguish them? You can't. Dark-skinned people and light-skinned people have the same melanin genes. It's just a matter of how they're expressed. Okay. Then there's this concept of a cline. You say, well, how come we have dark-skinned people living in Africa and light-skinned people living in Scandinavia? Well, if you have a gene pool that's then segmented, then that's the so-called cline, that there's adaptations and variations and sort of super concentration of those genes because there's not cross-fertilization of other kinds of genes. So now, wouldn't it be an evolutionary? Why would you want to say that there's some groups that are better that survive? Isn't that racism? And in fact, when Darwin was on his beagle, on his trip, he stopped at this Tierra del Fuego, which is down the southern tip of Chile, I think it's on the Chile side, not Argentina. And he said that the indigents living there, this is his quote from his book, they closely resembled devils. Okay? I think we'd all agree racism is just simply a skin. We're all made in God's image. So our summary of this first segment here is that history and language seem to point to a short period of time that is amazingly coincident with biblical chronology. Population statistics just don't fit well with a long time frame. We've seen many, many different things where major changes, we don't see transitional forms. In fact, you'd think we should have more fossils with transitions than we do with each step of finished product. And we don't see really any. There's a couple of sort of things that they say, this is a missing link, this is a each one of them doesn't really stand the rigors of analysis. And even at that, there's only about 5 of those candidates that they have. There should be billions of transitional forms, And there's a lot of seemingly inconsistency with classifications. These monumental changes is what I really want to be the take-home message, that how we go from cold-blooded to warm-blooded, to go from not having a backbone to having a backbone, to having paws to hands that take up a third or so of our brain, And all of this had to happen in a short period of time at certain points, this Cambrian explosion, or how the apes developed in only just a few million years in their billion-year time frame. So I thought this Duane Gish quotation was a good one. This is Duane Gish, and this is Henry Morris of the ICR. They're both, late. They both died a few years ago. But the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links not seen. Okay, we'll just go on. I think. I was going to bring up, and I didn't remember to bring with me, but I missed the prompting. There was a question last week about the bubonic plague, the Black Death, and saying, well, didn't that show some kind of evolution? So I looked it up, and I pulled out this article, and I copied it, and I read it, and The only time they really use evolution is in the title and in the introduction. So they're not even really claiming, but then they say in their final, they say, the point was that the people who survived the Black Plague happened to be people who had better genes for fighting or for overcoming the Black Plague. But it so happened that they were linked maybe to people who had a higher tendency to get autoimmune diseases. So if you have a higher overactive immune system for some reason, maybe that led to it. If anything, that disproves, that just shows you how anything that might have been selected for happened to have a negative impact rather than a positive impact. So the fact that they put evolution in the title of their scientific paper is misleading. But anyway, I wanted to show that because I can't remember, he was sitting over here who asked that question last week. So we've covered this already, but now what we're going to move on to is what I'm calling other creeping things. And what I really want to emphasize is that I think everything you're going to see here is much more, they're examples of design. I'm not going to hit you with really any more mathematics here, so no problem, And we're going to say how yet there's persistence of these lower forms. It's not like they died away, and we still have little things around that are playing vital, necessary roles in our life. And they all have complexity. Now, here's an interesting little thing, I think, that you maybe never think of. The kingdom Protista. Remember I told you there's now a bunch of, but one of the kingdoms is Protista. It's a unicellular, although it's eukaryote. They're like protozoa, algae, slime molds. Diatoms is one of them. They're very small. And they actually make up 80% of the ocean's biomass. They're mostly in the ocean, saltwater. And therefore, they produce about 50% of the Earth's oxygen through their photosynthesis. And they're the basis of the marine food chain. If we didn't have these little guys, we wouldn't have fish. The little animals wouldn't have fish to eat. We wouldn't have little animals to eat. We'd be in a bad way. So they're not earlier drafts of something more minor. They again use ATP. They've got DNA to reproduce with. So they're not earlier drafts of a final product. They're vital still components in our current world. Most microorganisms, contrary to your belief, are good for you. You need bacteria in our world. We need fungi in our world. Only a few of them actually cause disease. Famously, this is from a picture that Alexander Fleming took because he was trying to grow some bacteria, and one of his petri dishes became contaminated, if you know the story, with some fungi. And it turns out that the fungi inhibited the growth of his bacteria. But he was smart enough to put it together. The fungi are making something that kills bacteria. Could this be useful? And of course it was, and the rest is history. One of our first antibiotics. And saprophytic bacteria, those are the things, your compost pile. These things break down your stuff. So we can go on. They're their own kingdom. There's a lot of antibiotic resistance. We've covered this. I'm going to move along. A thing I want to emphasize is nitrogen fixation. We have 80% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. And nitrogen is a necessary component for life. You go to the Home Depot and you're going to see there's a certain amount of nitrogen in whatever fertilizer you're using. So you have to have nitrogen for things to grow, for plants to grow, much less for animals to grow. And there's a very complex, we're not going to go through, similar to Krebs cycle that recycles nitrogen, takes nitrogen from the air and makes it into nitrogen fixes nitrogen into things that plants can use. We need to have a certain amount of bugs growing in our body to have what we call the normal flora. And in fact, when people are on antibiotics too long, what happens is we get out of balance. And it kills a certain set of the population of antibiotics and lets the ones that aren't affected by those bacteria to overgrow, and they cause disease. That so-called Klebsiella colitis, not ulcerative colitis, but you can get sick from having too many bugs. Is the wrong set of bugs is what I'm trying to say. Pardon? SIBA? Yeah. Okay. I don't know. Okay. So, and remember as well, all of these minor microorganisms had, as I keep emphasizing, the sophisticated reproduction systems and ways of making energy. I'm just going to throw a bunch of things at you, I think, again, are examples of design, okay? Butterfly, it has special ways of trapping air pockets in their wings to fly efficiently and to avoid being saturated in a rainstorm. butterflies can still fly in a rainstorm. Otherwise, you'd think these paper wings would get too heavy and they'd fall down and they'd die. But they can't. Some butterflies, monarchs, can fly 3,000 miles transgenerationally. But honeybees, these navigation skills they have. 90% of aquatic insects inhabit fresh water, and there's all kinds of complexities. They use their back legs to steer, their middle legs to row. And interestingly to me, in that fossil record, there was a so-called hexapod gap. That just means 6 legs, right? Because insects have 6 legs. There was no insects in any of the fossil in this period of time, they said, which might be compatible with them being wiped out by a flood, right? Anyway. Tiger moths can jam the sonar of bats and avoid getting eaten up by bats. So they have a, F-16 jamming devices on them, So, and mosquitoes, the reason they know to go get flower nectar is they can sense CO2 levels. And the reason they land on us is so they can sense body heat. And that's what they want to bite us, So, now I was going to show this. You've probably heard, but I don't want to make it wait too long here. But the bombardier beetle is a really interesting thing. And some of you have probably heard of this. The bombardier beetle has these 2 different things, hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide, that they keep in 2 separate places in their body. And if they're threatened by a predator, they immediately are able to put this together. It makes an explosive reaction, and it squirts and kills. It sends this hot, toxic spray to whatever's trying to get at it. Maybe we could show just part of it, but it's really remarkable. I'm sensing that maybe some of you don't. I turned it on. Why? Anyway, can you control that from there? There we go. We'll just watch a couple of minutes of it, a minute or so. Just look what this thing does. Just imagine how could it not kill itself if it had a part way growing. If it mixed too prematurely, it would blow itself.
The bombardier beetle is one of nature's most improbable creatures. For some, it throws a monkey wrench into the whole idea of evolution. This beetle is a walking powder keg. That cloud you see is the result of a lightning-fast chemical reaction inside his body.
This upper one just shows some MIT biologist or bug guy who's able actually to put things inside and examine the innards of this tiny little beetle. He's not a creationist, it's just this is his area of interest.
Poison that sends his enemies running.
So we can go on to
he can even aim.
Oh, there we go. We'll just go on to the next one. So, but I mean, how could that happen bit by bit? Because any mistake earlier in a development, it would be fatal, and the bombardier beetle wouldn't have developed. So, insect metamorphosis. I told Tina I was going to call her out here because we were sitting one time. She says, that these larvae molt their skin 4 times before they turn into a pupa and then a butterfly. So, but if you just think of it a little bit, what's directing all of this? How could this happen? And if it didn't happen just this way for a butterfly to form, we wouldn't have butterflies. I mean, you couldn't just get a pupa that was pretty good at making a larva that was pretty good at making a pupa, and then a pupa that was pretty good at making a butterfly, and somehow have it all come together. It had to all work together in a very complex way of controlling it from the very start, or else we wouldn't have it at all. So anyway, just incredibly complex, and even some muscles are eliminated. And a lot of animals do a similar thing. They molt, and that had to be right from the start. I mean, this is a spider walking away from its skin. Here's a bee or something. And supposedly, I was reading, it's about 3 or 4 times per year a snake will shed its skin. So you'll see you'll see a molted snake skin in some places, and not to mention, fowl, etc., and lobsters even. I mean, imagine how complicated that is. There's the concept of codependence, that you have to not only have everything work together for one organism, but 2 organisms had to work together from the start. There's this so-called bucket orchid. And bees, they come into this cup here, and then once they're in here, somehow they're trapped, and they can only get out by crawling back out through a narrow tunnel here. And in the process, they're bringing that pollen to fertilize the orchid. So the orchid couldn't live without the pollen of the bee, and it had to be fertilized in just the right way, or pollinated in just the right way for that bee to be able to escape. So It's attracted by odors. There's a lot of things that are going on that I don't even know if they know the chemistry behind the whole thing, but one couldn't have developed without the other. So, grasshoppers. Now, grasshoppers have 6 legs, but if you read a lot of times people will say Leviticus is showing the non-validity of the Bible because it talks about creeping on all 4s to show that inaccuracy. But actually, we know that the grasshopper raises its jumping legs. It crawls on 4 legs, but it uses 2 of them to use when it really wants to, give a jolt and hop. So there's nothing inconsistent, if you're hit with this, there's nothing inconsistent in the Bible about a grasshopper indeed having 6 legs. So they can catapult with huge bursts of energy. I mean, who else could? They can jump like 3 feet. I mean, it'd be like us jumping to the 30th floor or something, So. The context. So, by the way, it's okay to eat grasshoppers. That's in the Bible. In the context, in the same. This was all in the context of saying that it's okay to eat grasshoppers. They're not an unclean being. Peppered moths. I think I mentioned this before. This is one of the real darlings of evolution. They cite that Manchester became an industrial city in the mid-19th century, and they say that the dark-colored moths, which were previously rare, became the predominant color of moths on the trees outside of the factories because of the soot, supposedly, and therefore the soot's on the trees, and the birds can't come and eat the. And there's all kinds of controversy about that. This was made, and there was an evaluation with this Kettlewell guy confirming it, and books still carry this story. But subsequently, these other people in the 60s and into 2000 have shown that it was a fraud for a variety of reasons. The pictures they took were actually of moths glued on the trees. Secondly, moths don't hang out on trees during the day. Have you ever seen a moth flying around in the day? They're at night, right? They come to the light at night. So birds they're not going to know whether they're light or dark in the dark. So that makes no sense. Moths that are eaten, they're very languid. The ones that actually get eaten by birds or some predator, they're not as strong and well equipped, so that's why they get caught. So it's not because their color, it's because they're not as vital like any other wounded animal, And indeed, there was 4 times as many dark ones as light ones in unpolluted forests, but when they stopped, it changed back. So it's just selection and national. It's just a shift. So there's nothing evolutionist about this, is the whole point. But, maybe they'd use that to make you feel bad about global warming and industrial and stop drilling and all that kind of stuff, Now, spiders actually aren't insects because they have 8 legs. But anyway, they're tiny. Even the tiniest ones have the capacity to make very complex webs. They make spider silk is like much stronger even than Kevlar, which means it's 100 times as strong as steel in terms of breaking. Kevlar, I think, is what the bulletproof vests are made out of, among other things. I think they use Kevlar even in modern bridges. I'm not sure, but anyway. So if you had spider silk the size of a garden hose, it could support the weight of 2 737s. That's how strong the spider silk. The lowly little spider can make silk that's much stronger than anything we can, dense and strong than anything we can make with all of our homunculus, Anyway, it can also stretch up to 40%, so it's strong and flexes. So again, a supposedly low-level thing is very complex and has by design, A fish. They all of a sudden they had to extract oxygen from water to live. How could that happen part way? They'd have suffocated and we wouldn't have any fish. It had to be all or none, or else they wouldn't be able to grow. Now, here's something you may not think about. Water, when it freezes, what happens? It floats. Icebergs float, right? If a pond freezes, it only freezes on the surface. And even if there's any Wisconsiners who do a lot of ice fishing, there's still fish down there, right? So imagine if the whole thing froze, or if it froze from bottom to top, all the fish would die every year, and then we wouldn't have any fish the next year. Okay, so that's a good little piece of design. When water freezes, it floats. It preserves the flora of what's living there. What makes a salmon? You've heard of the stories how salmon can go back up the river from within meters of where they were born, and then they spawn again at the same place. How do they know how to get there? They go against dams, they go up waterfalls, somehow they get there. and then as soon as they get there, they die. So their purpose is for their kids. Anyway, just saying. Sharks, why they have only cartilage. We don't have partway with some sharks with some bones, and there's no signs of any transitional bone. Lungfish talks about, is touted as a living fossil. But it really, if we look at the fossils from supposedly 100 million years ago, they exactly look the same as the lungfish of today. There's nothing primitive about them. And a lungfish has 5 eye color pigments, whereas we have 3. Why does a fish have to have technicolor? I don't know. An archerfish, similar to that bombardier beetle, the archerfish can squirt water to a low-lying insect, knock it out of its flight pattern, and retrieve it and eat it. If this is the way it depended on eating, how could it have survived one generation to another when it was partially improving its shot? It couldn't. And then they talk about blind fish. Actually, there's fish in caves that don't have eyes, yet they know how to navigate in dark caves, dark water-filled caves. And the thinking here is that, they don't rub against the cave and get their eyes scraped and infected and die. But anyway, just good design. Design features of amphibians, leeches. They have 32 brains and 10 stomachs. One would be good if they could develop that, right? Cuttlefish, octopus, they have 3 hearts. Okay? Frogs. Consider the complexities of going from these little eggs to the tadpoles to the frogs. All that had to work right the first time, similar to the butterfly, the cycle that we were showing. And furthermore, the amphibian develops its heart chambers in a very different sequence than humans or the next layer up, the reptiles or birds. So you're talking about major construction differences. It's like learning how to build a building immediately in a completely different way. How could that happen part way? I think this one's interesting. The Arctic wood frog, and some others as well, can actually be almost completely frozen. And the last thing ever, because it's got this innate antifreeze in its body, it's like the eyes and the head are the one thing that is the last thing to freeze. But their body can be like 70% frozen. Here's another frog species that actually swallows its fertilized eggs, stops eating, and the eggs can resist the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and that's born through the mouth. In other words, it has a way of producing its young if it doesn't have the water to do that. The whole concept of hibernation, I'm just going to put all of these up here. And bears don't actually technically, they suppress their metabolism. It's not supposedly true hibernation. Certain birds and others, they live off this brown fat, and they really wake up every couple of weeks, evidently. It's not like they're there for the whole winter. Turtles and reptiles, it's what's called brumation. They just go into a temporary dormancy. They don't regulate their temperature because, after all, they're cold-blooded, right? Insects go through what's called diapause. It's a type of dormancy. So when there's nothing for them to eat during the winter, they go into this thing. If this didn't work right the first time, the whole species would be dead by the next summer, and we wouldn't have frogs and insects and things like that. So it had to be right from the beginning, or else it couldn't be here today. I think this one's really interesting because I have a personal connection here. There's a study in mice that was done at the laboratory of this guy, Solomon Snyder, who was a triple professor when I was going to medical school. And he was teaching us mostly pharmacology, neuroscience, and I can't remember what the other thing is. But at any rate, he was known for, he discovered a lot of different receptors in the brain, most significantly the nitric oxide, just like dopamine is, the heat of battle. A lot of times you hear the stories, or maybe you even had yourself, you've been working and you were so fixated on what you did, you didn't realize that you had this big gash in your arm because you didn't feel the pain. That's because you have these dopamine receptors that in response to certain adrenaline and other things, you just don't feel that. So he discovered this one particular neurotransmitter called nitric oxide. Now, we've read Proverbs about let a man meet a bear robbed of his cubs rather than a fool in his folly. Well, he studied, I'm sure not because of this, but he studied in knockout mice. Knockout mice means that you either inactivate or you're able to extricate a part of the genetic code that encodes for a certain particular characteristic. So somehow or another, he was able to manipulate that. This was, right after the time that some of his superiors got the Nobel Prize for knowing about restriction enzymes to do such a thing. But at any rate, so he never got a Nobel Prize. He got a Lasker Award, which is supposedly the next best thing. And he found out that in the knockout mice, when it was lacking, males were much more aggressive. Females, it didn't make any difference whether they had the nitric oxide receptors or didn't. unless they were mothers. And if they were mothers, then having the knockout mice that were mothers were aggressive just like males. So there's a surge of this nitric oxide in a particular part of their brain that seems to explain that. So here's a very clear validation, shall we say, a science of a proverb that you don't want to go messing with a mother's children. So camouflage, this had to be right from the start. There's deer, fawn, leopards, there's all kinds of things that are well designed to blend into the scenery, and if they didn't, they would have been eaten by predators and we wouldn't have them today. And it had to be, you couldn't just have part of the body being white and part of it being brown, or else they'd be caught, right? So other animals have all other interactions. I showed you that codependence thing between the bee and the bucket orchid. Well, corals, they're symbiotic with plants, and they capture their food from the water by these little tentacles that they grow. And you've probably been to the Keys or whatever, and they'll tell you that, well, they grow very, very slow, and that's why it's so awful when a boat hits one. And I'm not trying to say we should go wrecking our coral reefs, but notice what this one's growing on. An old shoe. So this couldn't have taken hundreds of years for this coral to grow, because it's growing on an old sneaker. I mean, what is this, maybe 30 years or something that they found this. So. And interestingly to me, the corals actually have half as many genes as we do. And they're no simple thing either, right? Yeah, that's the one here. So it's 4 years old. This one was 4 years old, and they found another one somewhere in Australia that they know was there for 118 years for some reason. Oscar Wilde was an Irish poet and playwright in the 18th century. He's most known for the picture of Dorian Gray, any literary types around here. He said, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness. A cute little saying. But the point is that we use a lot of mimicry of God's creation in our everyday things. The burr, which sticks to things, is the idea that was behind the discovery or invention of Velcro. And you might even have some Velcro on you. We have a lot of things, or clothes, or, yeah, there you go, I hear it, Velcro. Van der Waals forces. Why can a gecko climb up the window? I mean, it's a smooth window. It's because of what's called van der Waals forces. I think I mentioned it, but didn't really embellish it, because its surface is so redundant. It's got so many tiny little surfaces that like things will want to be touching like things. It's not suction. It's just an attraction of like to like. And it's because the design of their feet it's so redundant that they have a huge surface area packed into each little finger of their paws. A fly. I think I mentioned this one before as well. A fly, their ears are only 0.5 millimeter apart, yet they can hear and localize very well, because they have this little mechanism where they can put some lever that sticks out from the nose and shakes in such a way that it triples the distance that they hear. And that's the same principle that's evidently used in some hearing aids that some of you might even have on tonight. So, the Wright brothers, they're the ones who said, well, fixed wings weren't working. People had been trying, you've all seen those pictures of people flying and then it goes crashing with it as soon as they let loose from the string that they were being drawn on. It's the Wright brothers that realized that they needed to flex the wing to have the different air speeds. Maybe they didn't have the full understanding of the aerodynamics of it, but they mimicked bird wings in order to be able to make a flyer that worked. Sponges have a lattice work, and this is the same technique that is actually used in certain modern buildings. I can't remember her name, but there's I think it's a Lebanese, she died a few years ago. She designed many famous buildings, including one in Miami, and they used the interaction of these different beams in different ways, a lattice work to support much more structure with less stuff. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail here with this, but serpents and dragons I just want to touch on, because the Bible is often ridiculed for this. Job talks about, the behemoth is talked about in Job, and it's widely described, though, in extra biblical texts, but that doesn't matter. And some are even alive today. I'm sure you must have been to some reserve somewhere and seen the Komodo dragon, but the more impressive ones like fire-breathing dragons, maybe they're extinct. Well, they fit well, don't they, with a dinosaur? That may be just what they used to describe a dinosaur. the Bible translates the words that might mean something like monster many different ways. So there's many places in the Bible that could well be describing dinosaurs, is all I'm trying to say here. And dinosaurs were previously called dragons until 1841 when, can't remember the name of the guys who coined the word dinosaur. So dinosaurs were supposedly vegetarians, so when you see these angry Tyrannosaurus rexes with some other dinosaur in its teeth, that's not true. But now, many mammal fossils are seen alongside dinosaur fossils as well, so that goes against it. Birds, they're perfectly designed for flight. They have hollow bones. They're able to breathe at high altitude, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. Seabirds, you must have seen if there's a seashore, you can't drink seawater, right? Or else you die faster, you go mad. Birds, I see them scooping a little water all the time. Well, they're able, because of special glands, ability to concentrate salt, they're actually able to drink seawater, whereas we can't. Flight, the dogma is that these reptile scales are the same thing as bird feathers, but I've mentioned before that these feathers are very different from scales. They have pores in them, they're flexible, they can change, and they're perfectly suited to be able to move with the aerodynamics that they need to in flight. Now, I thought this was interesting. We must have seen some planes, and this is not necessarily this, but there's something called a Handley page slot, where some wings will have an extra little piece on them. And the idea of that piece is to funnel the air so there's less turbulence, because what planes don't like is turbulence. If they have turbulence, they can't get lift. It's not the same thing as the Bernoulli principle, by the way, but either way. But certain birds have that feature. So, people who designed airplanes did that. Now, I mentioned earlier that birds, they fly way up high, right? And if they're flying up as high as like 30,000 feet, no, what's that? That should be 30,000. Yeah, 30,000 feet. It's only 4 atmospheres. So if we have 21% oxygen here at ground level, that means they're flying and exerting themselves with only 5% oxygen. And the reason they can do it, some birds even go higher like vultures, is they have a different way that their lung is put together. They don't breathe in and out like we do. The air goes through, and they are able to harvest the oxygen as the air is going through them. So again, I'd posit, how could this possibly develop step by step, or how could it have been? It would take a huge change to change not only the innards of what's the plumbing of the lungs, but the muscles that go into all that. It couldn't happen stepwise. Then you'd ask the question I raised earlier, how can flight evolve multiple times? Some people will tell you, flight developed 20 different times. Well, it would have to have developed, according to the trees, right, at least 4 different times, because mammals are over here and birds are over here, and they all developed the ability to fly. Bats, did you know that 25% of living mammal species are actually bats? But anyway, I throw little things. But all these different animals developed the ability to fly. Yet, for example, mammals, bats, the wings are anchored to the forelimb in the body, but also to the hind limb, which is very different from the way the bird is. So, again, how could that happen? If it didn't, and then did it happen? How could it happen stepwise? Because it would crash and burn. How could it happen multiple times? Just once would be pretty impressive. And then you say, well, was it because a land animal was able to jump higher and higher and then glide longer and then start flapping its wings? Or was it because some animal that was up in the tree was able to, go from a low limb and start gliding, and then a higher limb, and it gets a little bit ridiculous to think about it. This is one of my favorite things, this golden plover. It migrates all the way from Alaska to Hawaii, and there's no rest stops along the way. Some 2,500 miles, 250,000 wing beats it takes to get there over 88 hours. No refeeding. It's got to be able to make the whole way, or else it dies. It has to also be able to navigate, and the birds, they've never were able to do that the first time. It starts at a certain weight with a certain amount of fat, and it converts. If you calculate how much of its energy it converts per hour, it shouldn't make it. It should need 3 ounces of fat, but it makes it on 2.5 ounces of fat. Why does it make it? Because they form in a V formation, and therefore they can draft off of each other and take turns. You've seen birds do the same thing. And I thought that was, and another one goes even further from Alaska to Australia. And I thought that's kind of an illustration of Hebrews 10:21, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. Right? So anyway. Now birds, we already mentioned, birds had to go to get from dinos or reptiles or birds had to go from cold to being warm-blooded. But their hip bone is completely different. Their bones have to get hollowed out, and we don't see anybody that's got anything that's got a partial hollow and a full hollow. The respiratory system I told you about. They have, as I alluded to the fact that they have a 4-chamber heart. Reptiles have a 3-chamber heart. So a completely different way that the heart develops, and even how could you all of a sudden just spout another chamber in your heart, you know? The feather design is very different from scales. The leg construction is very different. And it's, in fact, they've done endocasts, and they say that a T-Rex looks probably more like a reptile than a bird shape. So it goes against the concept that the dinosaurs were the precursors. And by the way, marine fossils were found with dinosaurs. And so the chronology doesn't fit, is my whole point. And why did human evolution gyp us out of certain things? Birds can swivel, you know, certain birds, like, you know, you've seen owls, they can swivel all the way around. I mean, you know, we can see maybe 180 degrees, you know, they can put their arm out and they can look behind you, they can watch their own back, you know. And the eagle's eyesight is like 20/5, whereas normal sight for us might be 20/20. So they pack the photoreceptors, and I have a whole talk on eyes. I told you I was going to take that one. But now, just things you might not think about. Consider the complexities of eggs. Reptile eggs, bird eggs, this is, I guess, and reptile, they look completely different. Reptile eggs are softer and leatherier. Fish eggs are suited to be in the water. Amphibian eggs are suited to be in the water. So how could you go from this kind of an egg to that kind of an egg to that kind of an egg, or whatever the sequence is, in a step-by-step fashion? We see no evidence for it, and it challenges our intuition to think that could happen. So, okay. Amphibians to reptiles. The egg of a reptile is completely different from the egg of an amphibian. It develops this chorionic membrane, like we have an umbilical cord. It's a similar way, whereas the amphibian and fish eggs don't have that. So again, a completely different re-engineered way has to happen. That how could it happen bit by bit? It wouldn't make sense. It's got to be all in all. Lots of other differences between reptiles and amphibians, so how could they get there? And I said before, the heart and even the aortic arch is very different in the two. Major transitions, no signs of any intermediate forms, and really no room for any errors. How could it even happen step by step? Here's one that's, I think, good. They found whale fossils even in high land areas, not just at coastal areas. So does that suggest water covered the whole world at one point? Perhaps. Coal has been found under the oceans, which fits more with the flood than uniformitarianism as well. Mutations, here's a mutation that's really uncovering. They've studied this in detail and found that it's not a mutation of something there. It's a mutation that uncovers a previously untranscribable gene, a so-called super baby, a 4-year-old German that had these very strong developed muscles at a very young age. It so happened that both of the parents were very athletic, but they've got the details worked out. It's a loss of a regulator gene that controls muscle growth. And this is not evidence of evolution leading to a master race. And there's a kind of cattle that does the same thing, evidently, and also in mice. And we talked about how all dogs probably came from the same one, and you can actually show that it's because of loss of a growth-regulating gene that you can develop, bigger dogs than you did before. And living fossils I've been making reference to, but that's a problem for evolution, because if these were first or earlier drafts, then how could they still be surviving today? But there's these and many, many more, some 500. And I guess have to keep reminding that they all had the same basic way of getting ATP with this very complex, that we went over last time, way of making the ATP. The cytochrome C, which is, I think this one right, no, here it is, cytochrome C, is one that they've looked at, and it's present in a relatively unchanged way from the lowest beings that were fossils from millions of years ago. We're almost out of time here, but some theorize that life came from somewhere else. Well, even if it did, it begs the question. They had to have evolved somewhere else before it came here. It's there has to be a pretty high escape velocity. You can't just you can't just jump off one planet and get to another. You have to have a rocket ship with the right amount of thrust to generate a certain amount of speed. And it would be so far away, and it would have to go through space so that the sun or any other star's radiation would probably destroy the RNA, so it wouldn't be the DNA wouldn't be possible to grow again. What about life on Mars? I mean, when I was a kid, this was one of the popular shows, My Favorite Martian. Supposedly there's some remnants of life discovered in this Martian meteor discovered in Antarctica, but it was found, we're not sure about that, but maybe there's some bacterial fossils. It's not 100% understood that that's the case. It could have been produced by other natural inorganic means, by synthetic. It's been produced by inorganic means. Isaac Asimov, a very prolific science writer, he said that his discovery of life on one planet can transform the origin of life from a miracle to a statistic. And the canals that we remember here on the red planet on Mars, they're not water. Pioneer 10 has shown that it wasn't water. There's a large study that was done, or a large project that was underway back in the 60s to listen to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, CETA. It lost its funding, but then it got some funding from public or private money, and then some public money because it became, sexy again. This is called the Sagan Center, and I like to say that the operators are still waiting for the calls to be picked up. So the summary of creeping things is that I've shown many advanced mechanisms in simple life again, and moreover, that simple life, not only does it persist, but it plays a vital role in everything, our whole biome. There's no evidence or even possibility in some instances of a step-by-step development, because if all or none, if it didn't work, they'd be extinct. We've shown examples of many interdependent systems that need to be intact from the start, not only within a being, an organism, but between organisms. And we're finding fossils in illogical locations, in coexisting with supposedly newer things. And many places we see that we've made good progress because we have mimicked God's designs, or mimicked the designs, which is maybe something we should do more. So that covers our tonight. I'm going to tell you that next time will be 2 weeks from now, and we're going to cover, I mentioned it earlier, geology and some things about the flood. So I'm open for any questions if anybody has any. I think we went off the air now, didn't we, Bill? But, all right, well, I'm sorry I kept you a couple minutes longer, but we'll see you in 2 weeks.